Imagine a mother dog, shivering in the bitter cold, trapped for 2 endless days. Her puppies, weak and crying, wait in the darkness, hungry and confused. She risked everything to find them food, but now, she's fighting for her life. Will she make it back to them? Or is this where her story ends? The world around her was a frozen wasteland, a place where the air itself seemed to bite and claw at anything that dared venture outside. She had grown used to the harsh winters, but nothing had ever felt this brutal. The snow seemed to never end, falling in thick, heavy flakes that buried the streets and muffled the world. The landscape was a dull, colorless blur. White snow, gray skies, and the endless cold that pressed down on her with an unforgiving force. She was a mother, though she didn't feel like one. Not anymore. Her body had grown too weak, too thin to carry the strength that she once had. Once, her fur had been a rich, thick coat of brown and black. Now it hung from her bones in matted, icy patches, and each step she took was like a battle against her own failing body. But she was determined to keep going for them. For her puppies. 3 little lives, fragile and dependent on her for everything. She had been their protector since the day they were born, watching over them with a fierce love that had kept her going even when she herself had barely been able to stand. But the hunger, the cold, the constant fight to survive, it had worn her down. Her energy was fading, and with it, the strength to keep going. Yet, despite everything, she didn't stop. She couldn't. They were waiting for her. Her paws sank deep into the snow with each step, the cold biting at her, forcing her to pause every few moments to catch her breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a reminder that she was running out of time. She could feel the emptiness in her stomach, the gnawing hunger that threatened to consume her. But worse than the hunger was the fear that her little ones might not make it if she didn't find food for them soon. She had been looking for hours. The empty streets were like an endless maze of gray, offering no comfort, no sign of hope. The buildings were abandoned, their windows boarded up, the doors locked tight. Even the alleys, places she would have never dared enter in the past, were devoid of life. She paused for a moment, her ears straining to hear anything that might offer a sign of salvation. But there was nothing, only the wind, the snow, and the silence. She had to keep moving. As she trudged on, memories of better days flashed through her mind. She remembered the warmth of the sun on her back, the feel of soft grass beneath her paws, the joyful yelps of her puppies as they played in the field near the old barn. There had been a time when life had been easier, when they had been safe, warm, and fed. But those days felt like a distant dream now, fading further with each passing minute. The street she was walking on was unfamiliar, the buildings dark and unwelcoming. She had never ventured this far before, but hunger and desperation had pushed her to keep going. The wind howled through the alleyways, making her shiver as she pressed on, her body trembling from the cold. Every breath she took was a struggle, her chest tight and sore. It was becoming harder and harder to see through the thick layers of snow, and the world seemed to blur into one endless stretch of cold. It was then that she saw it, the faint outline of something ahead. Her eyes widened with hope. It looked like an alleyway, but this one was different. There was a faint warmth to it, an odd sense of promise in the air. She couldn't explain it, but something deep inside her told her to move toward it. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe this was where she would finally find what she was looking for. She hurried forward, her legs trembling with every step. The closer she got to the alley, the more her heart raced. She could smell something, food, perhaps? Her stomach growled in response, the sound almost deafening in the quiet night. As she turned into the alley, the smell grew stronger. Her body surged with adrenaline, pushing her forward. She didn't notice the trap at first, didn't see the dark shape hidden in the snow, waiting for her. And then, with a sharp snap, the metal caught her leg. Pain. The kind of pain that cuts straight through the bone, forcing her to cry out. She collapsed to the ground, her body crashing against the snow. Her heart raced as she tried to pull her leg free, but the trap wouldn't budge. She yelped again, the pain blinding her, and tried to stand, but her body was too weak, too exhausted to fight back. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she twisted and struggled, panic bubbling up inside her. The cold was unbearable now, her leg caught in the vice-like grip of the trap. She couldn't move. She couldn't escape. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought of her puppies. They were waiting for her, hungry and alone. The thought of them, vulnerable, scared, made her heart ache. She had to get back to them. But how? The pain in her leg was unbearable, and her strength was slipping away. Her body was too tired to keep fighting. She whimpered softly, her body trembling not just from the cold but from the overwhelming fear that gripped her heart. What if no one came? What if she couldn't get out of this trap? What if her puppies were left to fend for themselves? The thought was unbearable. Hours passed. She could feel the cold creeping deeper into her bones, stealing what little warmth she had left. Her body trembled uncontrollably, the pain in her leg gnawing at her, making it impossible to think clearly. But she couldn't give up. She wouldn't. Her puppies needed her. With the last of her strength, she pulled at the trap again, the sharp pain making her cry out. But no matter how hard she tried, the metal wouldn't give. The cold was unbearable, and the darkness seemed to press in on her, smothering her thoughts. She could feel herself slipping, but she held on to one thing, her love for them. She couldn't give up. And as the night stretched on, her eyes fluttered closed, her breath shallow, her body weak. The world around her was dark and cold, but in her heart, there was only one thought, her puppies. She had to survive. For them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to follow this emotional journey and stay updated on the next chapter. And leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support is everything. The snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, swirling around her in a constant, unforgiving dance. It was as if the heavens themselves had conspired to trap her in a blanket of white. Every breath she took was a painful reminder of the frigid air that had sunk deep into her chest, freezing her lungs with each inhalation. She could feel the frost creeping into her bones, numbing her limbs, but nothing could dull the agony of the trap clamped around her leg. The sharp metal teeth bit into her flesh with unrelenting force, drawing blood with each futile attempt she made to free herself. Her body was covered in a thick layer of snow, the cold seeping into her fur like poison, but it was nothing compared to the pain in her leg. She gritted her teeth, fighting back the whimper that threatened to escape her throat. She was a mother. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. Not when her puppies were depending on her. The trap had been set without mercy, its cruel mechanism leaving her with no way to escape. Her paw was caught fast, twisted in an unnatural angle as she pulled and tugged with all her strength. The pain was unbearable, but she had to keep trying. She had to get free. Her puppies needed her. Her mind drifted to them, their tiny faces flashing before her eyes. She could almost hear their soft cries, their tiny whimpers as they waited for her to return. 2 days. It had been 2 days since she had last seen them. 2 days since she had left them to search for food, for anything to sustain them in the harsh cold. She had promised them that she would always return. She had promised them safety, warmth, and love. But now, as she lay there, trapped and helpless, those promises seemed so fragile, so distant. The cold was relentless. It numbed her, made it harder to think, harder to move. But still, her mind refused to shut down. Her thoughts raced between the pain in her leg and the vision of her puppies huddled together in the small den she had made for them. They would be scared. They would be hungry. They would be wondering where their mother was, and the thought of that filled her with a deep, suffocating dread. With every pull, the trap dug deeper into her flesh, and with every breath, the cold seemed to settle further into her body. She could feel her strength slipping away, her movements growing weaker. The exhaustion was overwhelming. Her body was shaking not only from the cold but from the effort it took to free herself. The pain was so intense, it felt like it was consuming her. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. Not when they needed her. Not when there was still a chance. She tried to shift her body to find some new angle, but the metal was unforgiving. It wouldn't give. She was stuck. The wind howled around her, cutting through her fur, and for a moment, she wondered if the cold would be the end of her. But the thought of her puppies brought her back. The sound of their cries, their need for her. She could almost feel their tiny paws against her, their warm little bodies pressed up against her in the den. She could almost smell the sweet scent of them, so close, so innocent. But she was so far away, so far from them. A soft whimper escaped her as the pain flared again. The metal was digging into her leg, and her head felt light, as if the world was spinning around her. She was losing focus, the cold seeping into her brain, making it hard to think clearly. Her body was shutting down, but her mind refused to let go of one thought: her puppies. They were depending on her. She had to survive. Her thoughts were fragmented, pieces of memories flashing through her mind in quick succession. She thought of the first time she had held her puppies, their tiny bodies warm and soft in her arms. How they had looked up at her with such trust, such innocence. She had been their protector, their mother. And now, here she was, trapped, unable to protect them, unable to fulfill the one role she had been born for. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't help her. Crying wouldn't set her free. She had to stay strong. She had to fight. She twisted her body again, her leg burning with pain as she pulled with all her might, trying to break free from the trap. She could feel the muscles in her body trembling with the effort, but the trap remained unyielding. Each movement made the pain worse, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. Not when her puppies were waiting for her. Her breathing became more ragged, and she felt her vision starting to blur. The cold was too much. The pain was too much. But the thought of her puppies, the thought of them waiting for her, kept her from succumbing to the darkness. She thought of their little faces, their small bodies pressed together for warmth, waiting for their mother to return. The wind picked up, swirling around her in a frenzy. She could feel the chill deep in her bones, and yet, as much as her body screamed for rest, her mind refused to let go. She would not abandon them. She couldn't. For a fleeting moment, the trap seemed to loosen, just enough for her to think she might escape. Her heart surged with hope, but as she tugged once more, the metal teeth snapped shut again with a sickening crack. The cold had made it impossible to think clearly, but she refused to give up. No matter how cold, no matter how much it hurt, she would keep fighting. She had to. For them. Her puppies were out there, waiting, and she wouldn't rest until she was by their side again. The frigid air stung her face as she lay there, trapped beneath the relentless weight of the cold. It was like the world had turned its back on her, burying her in a tomb of ice and snow. But even in the crushing cold, her thoughts burned with a single, undying truth. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not when her puppies were depending on her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the cold stealing the warmth from her body with each exhale. The world around her had turned to a blur of white, the snowstorm intensifying as if the heavens themselves were pushing against her, testing her strength. She was losing time, and time was something she could not afford to lose. Her leg throbbed in excruciating pain, the trap still clamped around it, and every movement seemed to make it worse. The blood had long since frozen against her fur, and the wound beneath the metal teeth burned with an intensity that threatened to take away her will to keep fighting. She had never known such pain. The cold was no longer just an enemy. It was a force that seeped into her bones, into her very soul. It tried to smother her, to suffocate her, but her mind would not let go of one thing: her puppies. She had been a mother for so long. The instinct was second nature to her: protect, care for, feed. But now, that role felt impossibly distant, something she couldn't reach, no matter how desperately she tried. She had been away for 2 days. 2 long, endless days spent searching for food, for a way to provide for them. Every moment without them felt like a lifetime. They were out there somewhere, alone and vulnerable. She could feel their cries deep in her chest, echoing through the silence that surrounded her. They were waiting, waiting for her return. She had promised them that she would never leave them. She had promised to be their protector, their guide. She had promised to keep them safe. But now, As she lay trapped in the snow, she wondered if those promises would be broken. The thought was unbearable, a knot of guilt tightening around her heart. Every movement she made, every failed attempt to escape, only seemed to deepen the wound in her soul. Her mind kept flashing back to the day they had been born, the moment she had first held them in her arms, their tiny bodies warm against her fur. She remembered the softness of their fur, the sweet scent of them, and the warmth they radiated. They had been so small, so fragile, and yet so full of life. They had depended on her then, just as they depended on her now. Her heart swelled with the memory of them, their eyes wide with innocence, their little bodies wiggling in excitement. How could she have let this happen? How had she ended up in this situation? So far from them, so helpless. Another sharp wave of pain ripped through her leg, bringing her back to the present. She gasped, her teeth gritting against the agony. The pain was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the crushing weight of her helplessness. She couldn't stand it. She couldn't bear to feel this way, to know that her babies were out there, waiting for her. She shifted her body again, trying to find a way to relieve the pressure, but it was no use. The trap had a firm hold on her, and no matter how hard she pulled, it wouldn't budge. The snow around her had piled higher, the wind howling louder, but still, the trap held her fast. There was no escape. For a fleeting moment, a soft flicker of hope ignited in her chest. She thought she heard something, movement, a rustling in the snow. Was it a sign? Could it be someone who would help her, who would hear her cries and come to her aid? Her heart skipped a beat. She strained her ears, her body tensing with anticipation. But the sound faded as quickly as it had come. Her hope shattered like fragile glass. It was only the wind, only the storm. She was alone. The realization hit her like a wave. There would be no rescue. No one was coming for her. She was on her own. But she could not allow that thought to consume her. No matter how hopeless it seemed, no matter how cold the world became, she had one purpose left: to survive, to get back to her puppies. She could feel their little bodies calling to her, their need for her, and it was enough to reignite the fire within her. Her eyes, already tired and blurred, focused on the trap that held her. The cold had numbed her senses, but her mind was sharp. She could do this. She could break free. She had to. There was no other choice. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she tried again, her body trembling with the effort. Each movement was excruciating, each tug an agonizing reminder of her limitations. The pain in her leg was unbearable, but she would not stop. She couldn't, not when her puppies needed her. The wind picked up again, whipping around her, the snow stinging her face, but she barely noticed. She had grown numb to everything except for the image of her puppies, their tiny faces waiting for her. She could see them in her mind, their eyes full of love, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. They were so close, so real in her heart, but so far away in the storm. With one final, desperate effort, she pulled with all her might, and for a brief moment, the trap loosened just enough. A flicker of hope surged within her. She could do this. She could escape. Her body screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain. The trap shifted again, this time just enough to give her a glimpse of freedom. She was so close. Her breath hitched as she fought with everything she had left. She could feel the cold seep deeper into her body, but it no longer mattered. Not when there was a chance. But just as she thought she might be free, the trap snapped shut once more, its cruel teeth digging deeper into her leg. She collapsed against the snow, gasping for breath. Her body was shaking with exhaustion, but she refused to give up. The flicker of hope still burned in her chest, stronger than ever. She couldn't stop now. She wouldn't. Her puppies were waiting, and she would never stop fighting until she was back with them. The minutes blurred together as the storm continued to rage around her. The world was a frozen expanse, and all she could hear was the biting wind, the crunch of snow under her body, and the rhythmic pounding of her heart, which seemed to grow weaker with each passing second. The trap, still fastened tightly around her leg, felt like a weight that anchored her to the earth. making escape seem like an impossible dream. Yet, the thought of her puppies, their tiny forms waiting for her return, kept the flickering flame of hope alive inside her. She shifted her position again, gritting her teeth against the sharp pain in her leg. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each inhale colder than the last. But it didn't matter. She had no choice. There was no time to waste, no luxury of rest. Her puppies needed her. She had to get back to them. She had to survive. Her body, weak from the days spent in the cold and the exhaustion of her attempts to escape, was beginning to betray her. Her limbs felt stiff and numb, and the pain in her leg had become a constant presence, throbbing with every movement. But still, her mind remained sharp. She could feel the pull of her duty to her puppies, their soft, pleading eyes imprinted on her memory. They were depending on her. She couldn't let them down. The world around her felt impossibly distant, like she was trapped in a nightmare from which she could not awaken. The wind howled, driving the snow in all directions, blanketing the earth in an endless sea of white. She couldn't even see the sky anymore, only the swirling storm that seemed to conspire against her. Yet, even in the face of all this, there was a single thought that kept her grounded. She couldn't die here, not without knowing that her puppies were safe. Her mind raced, seeking any possible solution, any way out of this torment. She remembered the way her puppies had looked when she left them, their faces so trusting, so innocent. They had been so small, barely able to walk, and yet they had followed her every move with adoration. They were waiting for her to return, to feed them, to keep them warm. But now she was trapped, frozen in a world that didn't care for her or her struggle. The world was indifferent to her suffering, to her desperation. But it didn't matter. She would keep fighting. She shifted her weight again, pulling her injured leg as gently as she could, trying to find some relief from the unbearable pressure of the trap. The snow had piled higher around her, creating a barrier between her and the outside world. There was no sign of anyone coming, no one to hear her cries for help. She was alone, surrounded by a sea of snow and ice, with nothing but her determination to guide her. Her mind drifted again to her puppies, their small bodies curled up against each other for warmth. She could almost hear their soft whimpers, their cries for their mother. They were so young, so vulnerable. They needed her, and she needed them. That thought, that fierce need to protect them, was the only thing that kept her moving, kept her fighting. Even as her body grew weaker, even as the storm seemed to grow fiercer, she would not stop. She had already been here for 2 days, 2 days of struggling against the trap, against the cold, against the hopelessness that threatened to consume her. But even in the face of that despair, there was a small, stubborn part of her that refused to give in. She would not die here. Not today. Not without her puppies. She looked down at her leg, now swollen and bruised from the trap. The cold had numbed much of the pain, but it was still there, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. She could feel her body becoming weaker with every passing moment, but there was no time to rest. She had to keep moving. She had to find a way out. She tested the trap again, tugging at it with all the strength she had left. But it didn't budge. The metal teeth bit into her leg, holding her fast, keeping her in place. She cried out in frustration, the sound lost in the howling wind. She was running out of options, running out of time. But her puppies needed her. They couldn't survive without her. The cold, the pain, the isolation, they all threatened to overwhelm her, to drag her into the abyss of despair. But then, through the haze of exhaustion and suffering, she heard it. A soft sound, barely audible over the wind and the storm. It was a whimper, faint but unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could it be her puppies? The sound was so far away, and yet it stirred something deep inside her, something primal. Her body ached, her legs screamed in pain, but she could no longer ignore the call of her puppies. They were out there, somewhere just beyond her reach, and she would reach them. With renewed determination, she pulled at the trap again, her body screaming in protest. She could feel her strength waning, But she could also feel the warmth of her puppy's presence calling her forward. She couldn't give up. Not now. The whimpering grew louder, clearer, and she realized with a pang of relief that it wasn't just one puppy. It was all of them. They were calling for her, waiting for her, just as she had waited for them in the past. The thought of them, of their small, vulnerable bodies waiting for her return, filled her with a sudden surge of strength. She pulled harder, her teeth gritted against the pain. The trap was stubborn, unyielding, but she could feel it loosening, just slightly, with each movement. It was still painful, still agonizing, but now there was a purpose behind her every action. She had to survive. She had to get back to them. The storm raged around her, but she didn't notice it anymore. The cold, the pain, they no longer mattered. Only one thing mattered now, her puppies. The storm seemed to grow louder, the wind howling like a pack of wolves circling its prey. Each gust whipped against her face with relentless force, blinding her with stinging snow. Her body was near its breaking point, but her mind, her heart, refused to let go. The thought of her puppies kept her going, their innocent faces, their trust in her, their cries calling her from a distance she could no longer measure. She could hear them now, clear and sharp in the storm's chaos, and it drove her forward. Her injured leg, swollen and bruised, had become a mere extension of the trap, each movement sending electric pulses of pain that blurred her vision. The trap was still holding her, and every failed attempt to break free only deepened her frustration. But her resolve was stronger than the steel of the trap itself. She couldn't let the pain stop her, not when her babies needed her. She could feel the exhaustion creeping in, threatening to pull her under, but the voices of her puppies, soft, desperate whimpers, shook her out of her weariness. They were waiting. She could feel their little hearts beating, their small bodies shifting against the cold, their hunger growing stronger by the minute. She had no more time. Every second lost was another moment of weakness for them. She paused for just a moment to gather what little strength she had left. The storm was growing fiercer, and the snow was becoming a wall around her, trapping her deeper into the wilderness. The world seemed so far away now, as though it existed beyond the reach of her frozen limbs. But her puppies were out there, waiting, needing her. The thought of them gave her the will to push forward, to fight the wind, the pain, and the cold that threatened to drown her. Her breath came in labored gasps, her chest tight with the cold that now seemed to settle deep in her bones. She had no idea how much longer she could last, but there was no choice. With a guttural growl of frustration, she dug her claws into the snow and pulled harder at the trap, ignoring the sharp spikes of pain that shot through her body with each tug. The snow seemed to mock her efforts, piling higher, burying her further into the earth. But she kept fighting, every instinct in her body urging her to move, to push, to get back to her babies. In the distance, she could see something, a shadow against the gray of the storm. At first, it was a flicker, a mirage that could have been her imagination, but then it became clearer. There, through the swirling snow, was a figure, a silhouette against the white world, moving slowly but steadily toward her. Could it be someone? Someone who could help? Her heart raced with hope. She tried to make a sound, to call out, but the wind stole her voice. Her body was too weak, too exhausted to lift her head, but she focused all her remaining energy on the figure. It was moving closer, steadily pushing through the storm. The figure paused, and for a moment, she thought it might turn away, just like the others had done. But then, something changed. The figure stepped closer, moving with purpose, and she realized with a jolt that it wasn't a person at all. It was another dog. A larger, stronger dog, a male, with fur matted from the storm, his eyes filled with determination. He approached her cautiously, his gaze flicking to the trap around her leg. She could feel his presence, his energy, and for the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope light within her. The dog circled around her, his movements slow and careful, as though sizing her up. She could feel his warmth, the strength in his posture, and something in his eyes, the understanding that he knew exactly what she was going through. He sniffed at her leg, his nose brushing the cold metal of the trap. She looked up at him, her body trembling, not from fear but from the exhaustion that had finally caught up with her. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the soft shuffling of paws in the snow. She couldn't speak, couldn't make any further effort to help herself. She was running on fumes now, each breath coming harder than the last. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. But the dog, this stranger who had found her in the middle of the storm, seemed to understand. Without hesitation, he placed his powerful jaws around the trap's mechanism and tugged. For a moment, nothing happened. The trap was as stubborn as ever, refusing to give way to his strength. But then, with a sharp snap, it loosened. She gasped, her body shaking from the sudden rush of relief. She could feel the trap pulling away, the pressure around her leg easing, and for the first time in days, she could move without that unbearable weight on her. The dog stepped back, giving her space, and she took the opportunity to push herself to her feet, her injured leg trembling beneath her. She looked at him, gratitude flooding her chest. She couldn't speak, couldn't say thank you, but in her heart, she knew he had saved her. He had given her a chance. And now, with the trap finally gone, she had to act. Her puppies were still waiting for her. She could feel the warmth of the dog's presence beside her, as if he were silently urging her forward. Without a word, she began to move, her steps slow and unsteady at first but gaining strength as she went. The snow was still falling heavily, the storm still raging, but now there was a sense of direction, a sense of purpose. The world had seemed impossibly bleak only moments before, but now she could see a way out. She took each step with determination, her puppy's cries still echoing in her mind, urging her to move faster. The cold still gnawed at her bones, the wind still howled around her, but it didn't matter. She had been given a second chance, and she would not waste it. Behind her, the dog remained, keeping pace with her. He didn't leave her side, moving with her as though he were her guardian, her protector in this harsh world. They moved together, step by step, through the snow and the storm, each step bringing her closer to her puppies. And as they moved forward, a sense of unity began to form between them, a bond forged by survival, by a shared struggle, and by the promise of something better waiting on the other side. The storm may have been fierce, and the world around them may have seemed inhospitable, but for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. The puppies were out there, and she was coming for them. The storm began to weaken, though the wind still carried the sharp bite of winter's fury. The female dog, now free from the trap, limped forward with renewed determination. Each step brought her closer to the den where her puppies waited. Her injured leg throbbed, but the fire in her heart blazed brighter than the pain. Beside her, the larger dog moved like a silent sentinel, his presence an unexpected source of strength. She glanced at him briefly, her eyes speaking a language of gratitude that words could never capture. The journey felt endless. Snow weighed down her every step, and the path was treacherous. Deep drifts covered the ground, and ice hid beneath the surface, threatening to steal her footing. But she pressed on, drawing strength from the thought of her babies. Her mind painted their faces vividly, tiny, fragile creatures waiting for their mother. She imagined them curled up in the cold, their little bodies shivering, their cries growing weaker with each passing hour. The male dog stayed close, his steady presence anchoring her resolve. Occasionally, he would pause to glance back at her, ensuring she could keep up despite her injury. He seemed to understand her urgency, her desperation, and without hesitation, he continued to guide her through the relentless snow. As they neared the den, a faint sound reached her ears, soft whimpers carried by the wind. Her heart surged. It was them. She picked up her pace, ignoring the stabbing pain in her leg. The sound grew louder, and tears welled in her eyes, freezing instantly against her fur. She pushed forward, her breath coming in short, labored gasps. Finally, the entrance to the den came into view, partially hidden beneath a mound of snow. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled toward it, collapsing just outside. The male dog moved swiftly, clearing away the snow with his powerful paws. Inside, The faint cries became louder. She crawled into the den, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The sight that greeted her made her heart both ache and soar. Her puppies were huddled together, their tiny bodies pressed tightly for warmth. Their eyes opened at the sound of her arrival, and weak but joyful squeals filled the space. The female dog licked each one of them, her tears mixing with their soft fur. They nuzzled against her, their cries now replaced with contented whimpers. Despite their visible frailty, they were alive. She curled around them, shielding them with her body, providing the warmth and safety they had been missing. The male dog stood at the entrance, watching the reunion with quiet reverence. For a moment, he simply observed, his head lowered slightly, as if respecting the sanctity of the moment. Then, with deliberate movements, he turned and disappeared into the storm. The female dog watched him go, a pang of sorrow mixed with gratitude swelling in her chest. He had saved her, helped her when no one else did, and now he was gone, leaving her to focus entirely on her family. Hours passed, and the storm finally began to break. The sky cleared, revealing a pale blue canvas streaked with the faint orange glow of a distant sunrise. Inside the den, the warmth of the mother's body revived her puppies. Their small cries turned into contented sighs as they nursed, their tiny forms growing stronger with each passing moment. The female dog rested her head on the cold ground, her eyes half closed as she watched her puppies. Exhaustion threatened to pull her into sleep, but she fought it, unwilling to miss a single moment of this reunion. She had fought through impossible odds, endured pain and fear, and had been granted a miracle. Her mind wandered to the male dog who had helped her. Who was he? Where had he come from? She didn't even know his name, yet he had risked everything to save her. Perhaps, in some way, he had understood the bond between her and her puppies. Perhaps he had once known the pain of losing something precious. As the first rays of sunlight filtered into the den, the world seemed quieter, softer. The snow glistened like diamonds, and the biting cold began to ease. The female dog knew the fight wasn't over. She still had to find food and ensure her puppies grew strong. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself a rare sense of peace. She closed her eyes, her body finally surrendering to rest, but her heart remained alert, ready to protect her family at all costs. They had survived the storm, and she would make sure they thrived beyond it. Together, they would face whatever came next, stronger because they had each other. If the story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this tale has traveled. Stay tuned for more heartfelt stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable bonds of love. Thank you for being a part of this journey.